So apparently SoundCloud has a limit onto how many minutes that a person can post on their profile, and I am reaching that limit. So I think then this is going to be the last episode of Come Hell or Heavy Water that's going to be on SoundCloud. We're going to move to YouTube for the time being. I'll just have the channel under the same name, and you'll be able to find all the episodes there as soon as episode 4 comes out, I'm assuming. Alright, and let's get into it. You're sitting in a control room in front of multicolored panels. It's the third night shift you've worked in a row. Suddenly, the last thing you wanted to see appears on your monitor. Launch. And your job is to launch back. But not just any launch. A nuclear-armed attack. The clock's ticking. In minutes, your computer told you that 5 Minutemen ICBMs have been launched directly to your country's population centers. With all your systems and comrades screaming at you to initiate a retaliatory strike, something in your gut says not to do that. After 5 minutes, when the strike was supposed to occur, no earth-shattering rumble occurred, no second sun, no all-consuming fireball, just a whole lot of nothing. You have just prevented the death of the human race, and no one will know for decades. Hello and welcome to Come Hell or Heavy Water, where we talk about nuclear history, bombs, accidents, and energy. I'm your host, Nathan Kagashal. Today we're going to talk about the very scary concept of a broken arrow, and nuclear close calls. Somewhat covered up during the Cold War, we now have the luxury to look back on how close we actually got to nuclear war. I think there's a few ways of sorting these incidents. You have your typical accidents like dropping unarmed bombs and plane crashes, your lost nukes either from submarines or again dropped in transport, and the hand over the button close call where the Earth was seconds away from nuclear war. And we have gotten a lot closer to nuclear war than a lot of people would like to believe. Now, an organization as big as the United States military is bound to have some mishaps, and boy howdy did we have some mishaps with nuclear weapons, and I'm not talking about Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The peak of the United States nuclear arsenal was in 1967 with an eye-watering 31,255 nuclear weapons. That's enough to wipe out the entire landmass of Earth, a terrifying prospect. But what if that chain of events leading to our destruction happened by accident? Considering that the US has had 32 broken arrow incidents, that's just a poetic way of describing an accident occurring with a nuclear bomb. The first broken arrow incident was in 1950 off the coast of British Columbia. The crew was flying for 6 of 24 hours on a simulated nuclear strike to Carswell Air Force Base in Alaska. They carried a Mark IV nuclear bomb. The yield was 31 kilotons, or about double the strength of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Now I'm going to explain how a nuclear bomb works. They are encased in conventional explosives. They are used to start a chain reaction resulting in a nuclear detonation. But the bomb has to be armed by inserting a plutonium capsule inside. When said capsule is in place, that's when the bomb goes nuclear. Anyway, the aircraft developed, quote, serious mechanical difficulties, which led to 3 of the 6 engines being shut off. The plane dropped to 12,000 feet and began to coast on 3 engines, but conditions in the negative 40s led to ice buildup on the wings. Then they dropped to 8,000 feet, when the decision was made to drop the bomb. A bright flash of light, sound, and a shockwave was reported. This was the conventional explosives detonating inside the bomb. Luckily, the nuclear pit had not been inserted into the bomb before flight, or nuclear war with Canada could have broken out. The bomb was subsequently lost, and search efforts were fruitless. The bomb is still at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean off the coast of British Columbia. The US had a tough 1950 when it comes to broken arrows. 5 separate instances occurred the same year involving the loss of a nuclear weapon. None of them had the plutonium capsules which are necessary for a nuclear detonation. I found that the August 5, 1950 incident at Fairfield-Sunsin Air Force Base to be rather intriguing. A B-29 carrying a Mark IV bomb but no capsule was preparing for takeoff, but the plane experienced 2 issues. One of the landing gear was not retracting, and 2 runaway propellers. That means 2 propellers were running at, quote, fine speed, which is used only for slow maneuvers. They attempted to make an emergency landing, but the plane crashed and burned. It crashed mere meters away from a trailer park which housed 200 service members' families. The resulting fire went on for 12 to 15 minutes before the high explosives were detonated. 5,000 pounds of TNT detonated. The explosion destroyed about 25 cars and trailers. It left a hole 20 yards across and 6 feet deep, and it could be felt 30 miles away. All 19 of the crew died, including a brigadier general, Robert F. Travis, who was responding to the crash. He was a decorated World War II vet who flew 35 combat missions. The base was later renamed after him. Another accident in 1950 is a little bit more covered up. I'm just going to read what the Department of Defense says, as it is so short and subsequent information is hard to find. Quote, November 10th, 1950, B-50, over water outside of the United States. Because of an in-flight emergency, a weapon carrying no capsule of nuclear material was jettisoned over water from an altitude of 10,500 feet. A high explosive detonation was observed. And that's it. No location, no names, and not even the bomb was named. We can assume that the bomb on board was another Mark IV. Thanks to modern researchers, we now know a little bit more about the flight, as the declassified Department of Defense report on broken arrows is current only till 1981. At the time, the United States had 11 Mark IV bombs in Goose Bay, Labrador, and this flight was returning one to the U.S. Something went wrong with the engine, and when that happens, it's standard protocol to drop the bomb. The bomb was dropped over the St. Lawrence River and set to airburst at 2,500 feet, which it did. Searches for the bomb have been carried out, but have found none. A more famous case from 1950 would be on July 13th. A training flight that left Briggs Air Force Base in Texas was cruising at 7,000 feet when the nose began to point down, and the B-50 moved into a nosedive. The resulting explosion, which happened in Lebanon, Ohio, was reported to be heard from 25 miles away, leaving a crater 25 feet deep. Another Mark IV bomb was on board, with no nuclear capsule, again only leading to a conventional device being set off. All 16 of the crew died on impact. Our last story for 1950 comes out of Manzano, New Mexico, when a B-29 crashed into a mountain only 3 minutes after takeoff, carrying another Mark IV bomb, but this time something was different. Detonators were already inserted and ready to fire, which they did when the plane crashed. Only some of the high explosives went off. Some burned off in the following fire, but again, thanks to safety reasons, the capsules holding nuclear material were not inserted, causing only the high explosive portion of the bomb to detonate. That seems to be a trend, keeping the capsules out unless there was a code sent out to put them in. That kind of reminds me of Dr. Strangelove, how a code was sent out and could be returned, yada yada yada. We managed to go a full 6 years before we mishandled another weapon of mass destruction too. Nicely done. March 10th, 1956, a B-47 was on a non-stop deployment from MacDill Air Force Base to an overseas base, wherever that may be. The B-47 was not carrying a bomb, but the ever more important nuclear capsule, 2 of them to be exact. First refueling went as normal, but the second was strange. The plane descended through a solid mass of clouds to 14,000 feet, where it was supposed to meet up with the tanker. It never did. The plane went missing somewhere over the Mediterranean, and searchers came back empty-handed. No crew, no plane, and no capsules. A French news source reported that the plane had exploded overseas near Setbana, Morocco, off of the coast. U.S. Air Force reports coincided with that, putting the last known location of the flight 90 miles southwest of Oran, Algeria. American, British, Spanish, French, and Moroccan soldiers searched for anything but reported nothing. Unsurprisingly, this led to rumors of a cover-up and conspiracy, and I'm not going to entertain any of those theories. Though when any nuclear material goes missing, it's wrapped in black ink and red tape, making it nearly impossible to find any information on the accident, but that doesn't mean it was a cover-up. I do think it is a very good mystery, as no distress signals were sent out, and neither were any fervent radio calls sent from the plane. Our next broken arrow. A B-47 carrying no weapons was having a sketchy landing on a wet runway when it rammed into a storage igloo after losing control. This igloo had a group of 3 Mark VI bombs, none with the capsules inserted, but the Mark VI was stocked with 8,000 tons of TNT each, totaling 24,000 tons of TNT. I forgot to mention this happened the 27th of July, 1956, on Laken Heath Royal Air Force Base, about 20 miles away from Cambridge. The fuel set fire to the igloo and could have set off the explosives. If that had happened, pieces of uranium could have been spread over a large portion of eastern England, leading to its contamination. Well, not just contamination, but potential nuclear devastation. I'm not sure if I've made it clear what's underlying all of these, and they dropped the bomb and a conventional explosion was observed reports. If one of these bombs had a nuclear explosion, that would lead to all nukes being fired. If one country observed a nuclear detonation, especially one on their Air Force base, it would surely have led to nuclear war. If one of these accidents resulted in anything other than high explosives detonating, I wouldn't be here recording, and you certainly would not be listening to this. The next broken arrow was May 22nd, 1957, in Kirtland Air Force Base, and this was something special. The bomb that the B-36 was carrying was no ordinary nuke. The Mark 17 was the first hydrogen bomb produced by the United States. Its sister bomb, the Mark 24 and the Mark 17, started production in 1954 and ended production in 1955. In total, 200 were produced. The Mark 17 weighed a staggering 25 tons and was 24 feet 8 inches long with a diameter of 61 inches. Its yield, 15 megatons. The same year it entered production was the same year the Castle Bravo test took place, which had the same yield. The Department of Defense's reaction to the test was, "Holy shit, that's bigger than we thought." And in the next few months, they were fielded. Fast forward to 1957 on a dusty Air Force base in New Mexico. This world ender was being transported from Briggs Army Base in Texas. Coming into Kirtland, only 1,700 feet off the ground, the bomb slammed through the bay doors, hurtling them towards the ground. The bomb parachute did open, but because of how low the plane was, it did not slow it down. It landed only 4.5 miles away from the base, leaving a crater 12 feet deep and 25 feet across. The bomb landed in uninhabited land that was owned by the University of New Mexico. Radiation was measured in and on the lip of the crater, but it only read about 0.5 millirochnit per hour. Luckily, again, the nuclear capsules were not in the bomb, so no nuclear detonation was possible. But why did the bomb drop? According to the Department of Defense, a safety pin was inserted wrong, leading to the bomb to crash out of its cradle and through the bomb bay doors. There's this great website I've been using to get a grasp on the amount of destruction that could have been caused by these accidents. It's called nukemap.com. What you do is you pick a point of detonation, select airburst or surface, pick a bomb, and detonate it to see what would have happened. I went to Kirtland Air Force Base, moved out about 4 miles, and detonated a 15 megaton bomb. All of Albuquerque would have had third-degree burns, half of it would be wiped out from the shockwave, and about a fourth would have been burned by the bomb's fireball. The fallout, if the wind blew correctly, would stretch 931 miles in whatever direction. Not to mention that a nuclear bomb going off over an Air Force base would most definitely cause a return strike, though it would not have been retaliatory. I think another theme of these is that most of the bombs were lost, just like in our next case. July 28, 1957, off the east coast of the U.S., a C-124 carrying 3 Mark V bombs was forced to drop its payload. 1 nuclear capsule was on board but not inserted into any of the weapons. Suddenly, engines 1 and 2 lost power, and the crew decided for their safety and the airplanes, the bomb had to go. The first was dropped at 4,500 feet, the second at 2,500 feet. Now here's where it gets interesting. No detonation was observed on either of the drops. The Department of Defense says, quote, "Both weapons are presumed to have been damaged from impact with the ocean surface. Both weapons are presumed to have submerged almost instantly," unquote. And I'm only halfway believing this. We saw in all of our other incidents that when the conventional explosives go off, the bomb can still be recovered in some sense. In my mind, the bombs were fine when they landed. I mean, they're huge tubes of metal built with the utmost care and attention. At any rate, searches were conducted, but nothing came to the surface. So, arguably, 2 intact Mark V nuclear bombs are somewhere off of the coast of New Jersey. I'm going to jump ahead to 1966 to make a point. One of the most publicized broken arrow incidents occurred in the skies over Palomares, Spain. A B-52 was headed back to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina, and it was scheduled for a refueling. The routine procedure fell apart when the KC-135 tanker's boom ripped open the top of the bomber, causing it to fall apart. If this wasn't bad enough, the 40,000 gallons of jet fuel on the tanker ignited. 4 of the 11 of the B-52 managed to get out. The B-52 was carrying 4 B-28 bombs with a combined yield of about 20 to 25 megatons. No one really knows, as the B-28 had different yields and we do not know the specifics on this accident. Of the 4, 3 landed on land in a 100-mile-long debris field. 2 of them experienced a conventional explosion with plutonium being scattered around like confetti. The U.S. did clean up its mess, though, taking the contaminated soil back to the U.S. for storage. The 3rd bomb did not explode but remained relatively intact. The 4th bomb was nowhere to be found. The crash happened at 35,000 feet, and again, debris was spread over 100 miles on both land and sea, so the bomb might as well have been in the trash. But we're not one to give up, apparently, even though we've lost a total of 6 nuclear bombs. A 2.5-month-long search ensued for the weapon, and eventually was recovered. After 27 Navy ships were called, the United Kingdom and Spain helping, and the fancy Bayesian search theory, which is a mathematical way of finding things that are lost at sea, was implemented, the bomb was located on March 17th by DSV Alvin, but was dropped again, yes again, onto the seafloor when trying to pull it up to the surface. The bomb was then lost again till the 2nd of April when the Navy decided to bring in a torpedo recovery vehicle to bring the bomb back up to the surface. It was waiting for them at a depth of about 2,900 feet. It was relatively intact, save a dent on the nose. It was then returned to the United States. Before I make this point, there's a strange tidbit to the story I'd like to share. A fisherman, Francisco Simon Ortez, saw the bomb enter the water. He was hired by the Air Force to help the search. After it was found, Simone went to the First Federal District Court of New York with his lawyer, Herbert Brownwell, who just happens to be the former Attorney General. The reason he went to court? To sue for salvage rights on a hydrogen bomb. His argument went, quote, "It is customary maritime law that the person who identifies the location of a ship to be salvaged has the right to a salvage award if that identification leads to a successful recovery. The amount is nominal, usually 1 to 2%, sometimes a bit more, of the intrinsic value to the owner of the thing salvaged. But the thing salvaged off of Palermo's was a hydrogen bomb, the same bomb valued by no less an authority than the Secretary of Defense at $2 billion, each percent of which is, of course, $20 million, unquote. That's a direct quote from Brownwell. And he won the case. The Air Force paid him an undisclosed amount of money, but Simone says he was never paid. Anyway, to the point I was trying to make. The bomb dropped in 1957 only dropped from either 2,500 or 4,500 feet, respectively. They weighed 3,025 pounds each without the capsule inserted. The bombs dropped in 1966 went from 30,000 feet and weighed 2,320 pounds without the capsule. So to me, while the Mark V is about 700 pounds heavier than the B-28, the fact that the B-28 survived a drop from that high with just a dent tells me that the Mark Vs are just fine. I'm no scientist, and I'm not claiming to be, but I am claiming that there are probably 2 intact Mark V nuclear bombs sitting on the ocean floor. If anything, this is still an ongoing broken arrow. If someone wants to find them, they can. I think one of the most terrifying aspects of some of these is that they are happening outside of our country. I'm not even necessarily afraid of the idea of other countries having this technology. Mutually assured destruction blocks that fear for me. The fact is that we, the United States, have been pushing our agenda on other states and projecting our power through our military, whether that be through outright war or in the case of ferrying around nuclear bombs. What gets to me is by doing this, we are inadvertently exposing millions of people who are not our citizens and who are no way affiliated with the United States to the danger of nuclear annihilation. Yes, it could be argued that in certain cases, being part of NATO is already putting a country at risk for a nuclear strike, but Spain wasn't even part of NATO when the Palermo's incident occurred. It's just disturbing to me that we put other people at risk of nuclear devastation just by flying over their airspace. So maybe we shouldn't have these weapons at all, though that's a topic for a different episode. There are 32 instances of broken arrows between 1950 and 1980, committed by the United States alone, from the 1950s. January 31st, 1959, at an overseas base, a B-47 was preparing for a simulated takeoff during an exercise alert, though this time something was different than all the other accidents I talked about, and it's a big difference. The nuclear capsule containing plutonium was inside of the bomb. The Mark 36 hydrogen bomb with a yield of about 10 megatons came out of the Castle Bravo tests. Anyway, the plane was taking off, and it reached about 30 knots when the left rear wheel casing broke off, leading to the tail to crash into the runway. The fuel tank ruptured and the plane caught fire. Luckily, all crewmen escaped the fire. A hole was burned into the runway, and of course, the bomber was burned to a skeleton. The fire burned for 7 hours, and the entire base was evacuated. Miraculously, no explosion occurred. If so, the bomb would have detonated and destroyed the surrounding area. The location of the base was kept classified till the 80s when a nuclear weapons researcher, Robert S. Norris, identified the base as Sidi Slimane in Morocco. This was a worry for the State Department as Morocco was on the ideological fence, not picking a side in the Cold War at this point. A declassified letter from the Office of the Political Advisor headquarters revealed how we truly felt about the accident. Quote, Considering how shrill our stolid British allies have been on the subject of nuclear accidents, albeit with political motivation, I was very impressed with Ambassador Cannon's handling of the situation with the Moroccans, who are neither stolid nor allied with us." Unquote. This reads like there's a sort of laxness when it comes to nuclear weapons, calling the British shrill when reacting to broken arrows, downplaying the accident to the Moroccans, they only told the king, and not just that, but in another letter, the nuclear bomb is referred to as one of those things. The letter continues, quote, "At the same time, I am concerned about the inconsistency between our assurances concerning the relative safety of nuclear weapons and the instant case involving one was apparently an ordered overcaution. I don't really understand how someone can be overcautious with a nuclear bomb, let alone a 10 megaton bomb that was primed for exploding. I think this ties back to my point made earlier. We were putting people who wanted nothing to do with nuclear war in danger of nuclear war. While these two quotes don't cover the entire policy of the United States concerning nuclear weapons, it seems that when they are out of the country, a sort of whatever happens, happens mentality reigns supreme. While all of these accidents inch the world closer to nuclear annihilation, even if it was just for a second, there have been other instances that played out for weeks at a time where nuclear war could have broken out at any second. One of those instances I described in the intro, but I want to go more into depth about that incident. Just a little under a 2-hour drive from Moscow is a military townlet of Sereprokhov 15. It was built in 1982 and was to serve as the monitor for the early warning signals coming in from the satellites. On a September night, only a year after the facility had been built, it was about to be used. Stanislav Petrov had just come into work for the night, and before he had even gotten comfortable, alarms started to go off. Petrov was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Force and had been in the military since 1972. He was pretty much put immediately to work on the early detection system. Before that, he attended the Kiev Higher Engineering Radio Technical College, so I think it's safe to say he knew his way around this equipment. A little past midnight, a red panel lit up in front of him and said, "Launch," meaning that the satellites over the US had detected a nuclear attack. Petrov was in a precarious position, and I don't just mean the fate of the world was in his hands. He was a sort of middleman between the machines and subordinates on the bottom and the generals and politicians on tops. It was his decision whether or not to tell the premier, Yuri Andropov, that a launch had been detected. Now, 1983 was one of the most tense times in the Cold War. The Soviets had a new leader, Reagan was putting new pressures on the USSR, and most importantly, arms treaties were at a standstill. Not only that, but NATO was preparing for its upcoming war game, Able Archer 83, which had put the eyes of the entire Union on the border to the west. Soon enough, the computers were, quote, roaring. Petrov recalled 5 separate signatures. Something must have told Petrov that this was false. To me, I think it was expected that more than 5 missiles would be launched, rather than just 5. But, on the other hand, if those 5 missiles struck the biggest population centers, 20.6 million people would have died, or about 14% of the country's population. These are numbers from 2010. In under 5 minutes, and under incredible stress, Petrov concluded that the reports were false. "I had a funny feeling in my gut," he said. "I didn't want to make a mistake. I made a decision, and that was it." Petrov later admitted that his decision was made partly on a guess. Like I said earlier, it's not really right, in big quotes, to start nuclear war with only 5 missiles. While this could absolutely obliterate population centers, that's about all it could really do. With only 5 missiles, the Soviets would still be capable of retaliating. He was told multiple times by higher-ups that an attack would be enormous, basically flooding the system with warnings, and that was not the case here. On top of that, ground-based radars were not picking up missiles over the horizon. Normally, they have to wait a few minutes after satellites pick up the signal to see the same one. While the ground-based radar folks had a command center somewhere else, they did work in conjunction, and no confirming reports were coming in. Lastly, the system was very new and raw. There had even been some speculation on its reliability. The missiles soon disappeared off of the radar, and rather than crashing down onto an unsuspecting population, nothing happened. The cause of the false alarm? A rare alignment of the sun and some clouds that hit the satellite just right, leading to the signal being sent. At first, Petrov was praised by his comrades and some of the lower brass for his actions. He did in fact save the world and all future generations. But after that, things got strange. Petrov was interrogated and questioned ruthlessly as to why he did not initiate a return attack. One question that kept coming back was why he hadn't written down the events from that night. His reply? "Because I had a phone in one hand and an intercom in the other, and I don't have a third hand." Ultimately, the Soviets were trying to find a scapegoat for their false alarm.
In the end, Petrov was neither punished or rewarded, though he should have gotten the highest of honors from all countries, in my opinion. He would eventually be awarded the title of a world citizen, along with a financial award from the Association of World Citizens. The Dresden Peace Prize was also given to him, along with 25,000 euros in 2013. Petrov passed away in 2017 after being diagnosed with hypostatic pneumonia.
I mentioned Able Archer very briefly earlier, but this is something that needs a lot of explaining, as it brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Coming out of the 1970s with all its détente and mutually assured destruction, the 1980s would be much different. Even starting as far back as the Carter administration, when NATO decided to station missiles in Europe in a response to the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan. After Carter left, we got the most commie-hating president of the United States, Ronald Reagan. He believed that the Soviets had a doctrine of world revolution which arguably was never the case. Maybe, just maybe back in London's day, but that's it. This led American foreign policy to change from deterrence to defense, and that defense involved a new rearmament of nuclear weapons, and that spooked the Soviets. To them, it appeared that everything that had been done to prevent nuclear war in the past decade was being undone. Carter had also signed something called Presidential Directive No. 59. This is kind of like a report and an executive order rolled into one. It said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that nuclear war was indeed survivable, and that the United States was determined to survive it. This further chipped away at the idea of mutually assured destruction. It also implied that the use of smaller nuclear weapons in a long drawn-out war rather than a nuclear exchange was indeed plausible. Didn't Jimmy Carter win the Nobel Peace Prize? Weird. This is getting off topic, but arguably, Carter was trying to deter all-out war. Beforehand, the policy surrounding nuclear war was a single integrated operational plan, or shooting all nukes at once. PD-59 gave the president more flexibility if war ever broke out. But anyway, in 1981, Reagan signed the National Security Decision Directive No. 13. This was sort of an extension of PD No. 59. It outlined a hope that the United States could hold out for 180 days minimum during a protracted nuclear war. During this time, the United States planned to hit a total of 50,000 targets inside of the Soviet Union. This included 25,000 military, 15,000 economic and industrial, and 5,000 leadership targets. That leaves 5,000 more. My source, When Truth is Stranger Than Fiction, the Able Archer incident, only lists those, so where or what those 5,000 other targets were, I'm not sure. The thinking of NSDD-13 would not be policy until the new SIOP-6 was made the new strategic doctrine. SIOP-6 was signed October 1st, 1983, only a month before Able Archer was supposed to start. Now, while all of these policy changes are happening, the Soviets are standing there anxiously watching. In 1941, the USSR was shocked when the Nazis overran their border. This fear hadn't exactly left. The general consensus amongst the Soviet Politburo was that they would be on the defense no matter what, even if they shot first. They were absolutely terrified of a surprise attack. Again, the feelings from 1941 still prevailed. In fact, most of the Soviet leadership had served in World War II, which even more played into the feelings of defensive actions. When the United States' new doctrine was all about a limited exchange and survivability, the Soviet strategy remained the same. They were still ready and willing to fire all weapons at once in an attempt to gain the upper hand. A preeminent strike was part of the military doctrine of the Union, even though a no first use policy was in place. Soviet intelligence coming from the West was informing the leaders that a major troop movement east was happening, and a land-air battle plan for the U.S. Fifth Army in the West was also found. Essentially, it was a plan on how to strike deep and fast into the east with probable use of tactical nuclear weapons. Their intelligence was confirming their suspicions of an aggressive NATO, and invasion seemed imminent to the Soviets. Politburo officials were increasingly becoming more on the offensive side as well. Civilian voices in the government were few and far between, and that vacuum was filled by military voices. A circle of suspicion, intel, offensive bias, and dogpiling was leading the Soviets to one conclusion: nuclear war was an inevitability. Andropov would only be in office for a few years, and he had basically no experience outside of the KGB. He attempted to have summits with Reagan in 1982 to discuss new arms treaties and continued peace, but the Americans declined. Nice. They read this as the U.S. saying that they were now predatory and no longer looking for peace. This was confirmed by Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative when defense spending was upped in an attempt to squeeze the Soviets dry. So all of this was culminating into this huge overarching fear amongst the Soviets that they were definitely going to be struck first. And in response, the Soviets drafted Operation get ready for some butchered Russian, Yakutenko Yadanoy Napandin, or Operation Ryan. Operation Ryan was the GRU and the KGB working in cooperation to search for indications of an impending nuclear strike. Spies watched everything from lights in offices after hours to blood donations. Operation Ryan was enacted for only one reason: to warn the Soviet government of an incoming attack. Their slogan? Don't miss it! Ryan was strengthened in 1983 following Reagan's Evil Empire speech, and information collected from Ryan was being used in daily Politburo meetings. The stage was set for the preparation of Able Archer 83. In the 16 months leading up to the war game, the U.S. military was involved in combat in Grenada, Libya, Lebanon, and of course various Latin American countries. The Soviets had also shot down a Korean passenger plane, KAL-007, in September of 1983. The plane flew over 8 of 11 radar stations before being detected. If the plane was a missile, it would have passed undetected into Soviet territory. Our old friend Petrov also experienced his nuclear close call in 83. These two instances showed massive gaps and flaws in the Soviets' warning system. Reports coming in from Ryan were also confirming that yes, a strike was about to occur. When the U.S. Marines' barracks in Lebanon was bombed, all bases in Europe were alerted and on standby. This all leads up to November 2nd, when the Soviets really started to get scared. While Able Archer was an annual exercise, the Soviets were especially on edge this year for the reasons we just discussed. To them, it appeared the whole of NATO was preparing for a first strike. When it started on the 2nd, a KGB officer who was working for Ryan estimated that the strike would be in 7 to 10 days. The Soviets responded to the scramble in the West by upping their readiness. U.S. intelligence confirmed that nuclear bombers in East Germany and Poland were on strip alert, which was a heightened sense of defense. The Soviet 4th Air Army went to increased readiness, suspending all combat flights. Ryan was informed to search for new indications of a nuclear strike, and they saw what they wanted to: more movements of officials, American radio silence, which both pointed towards an approaching attack. With all of these reports coming in, the Soviets legitimately had their hand over the button, the two keys were ready to be turned, the premier was ready to shuffle to his bunker, and the red phone was out of the jack. It's terrifying to think how close we got to nuclear war. Say one of those broken arrows that we talked about earlier in the episode occurred. That would have for sure been enough to set the Soviets off and unleash all of their nuclear weapons. In the end, no nuclear exchange happened, but let's look at some of those intentions and policies. PD-59, NSDD-13, and SIOP-6 were all new doctrines that changed the outlook of nuclear war. The United States government, stress on the government, now viewed nuclear war as survivable. Arguably, nuclear war is not survivable, and any remnant of society would be drastically different from what we saw and see today. While this is strictly speculation, I think the United States might have been provoking the Soviets in Able Archer. I like to imagine two high schoolers fighting, yelling "swing first" at each other. Both of them are equally strong, but after some time, one thinks, "I could kick this dude's ass," and swings. In this teen's head, the punch is so strong it puts the other one on the floor. When the punch is actually thrown, its response is a flurry of swings, leading to both of them lying on the floor and neither of them winning. And that's exactly what would have happened if Able Archer went hot. America, with its new president, might have felt a little too big for its britches. In reality, Able Archer was similar to the entirety of the Cold War, a pissing contest, just with the fate of the world on its shoulders. In the end, Able Archer was a non-event, culminating in both sides just staring each other down. Yet the attitude of fear, suspicion, and poor conclusions could have easily led to either side sending the world out in nuclear hellfire. And there's another instance where the world got dangerously close to nuclear hellfire, and I'm not talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1973, the United States and Soviet Union almost fired nukes over Syria. That seems like foreshadowing. The Yom Kippur War started on the 6th of October 1973, almost 10 years to the day of the start of Able Archer 83. So when people think about who has a nuclear program, most assume that it's just the US and Russia. But of course we know that that's not really the case. Multiple countries have nuclear weapons, some that one wouldn't really expect to have. And one such case is Israel. It's kind of reasonable for them to have them, considering how much fighting they do. Though not much is known about the Israeli nuclear program, we do know that it started off with the French giving them some tech and uranium. Their current stockpile is unknown, but estimates put it at between 80 and 400, and they've been producing nuclear arms since 1967. Anyway, in 1973, Syria and Egypt launched a surprise attack on the Golan and Sinai Heights. The Syrians were pushing hard and the Israelis were very scared. Early in the war, Golda Meir, the Israeli prime minister, was approached and asked if nuclear weapons should be deployed. She declined. Al-Assad was reportedly worried about the crossing of the Jordan River for fear of starting a nuclear war. Israeli nukes weren't exactly the problem here, though. Both the United States and the USSR had stakes in this fight. Immediately, a Soviet presence in the Mediterranean was up to 100 ships, with 2 admirals on board. They were shadowing American carriers who were shadowing Soviet subs. Each side had missiles trained on one another, and American planes flew low overhead the Soviets. And that's about as far as they got in terms of fighting. But for the duration of the war, which only lasted 20 days, tensions between the Soviets and the American were scarily high. One stray bullet or a mispress on a button, and there goes the world. Now, I understand that Able Archer 83 and the Yom Kippur War's nuclear scare are both basically non-events, but I think they're a lot more nuanced than that. Everybody knows how tense the Cuban Missile Crisis was, because yeah, that's the closest we've ever gotten to a nuclear exchange. And the same goes for these as well. Just like Cuba, the wrong thing said or done could have ended the world. The history of what didn't happen during the Cold War is just as important. It's kind of a lesson. If we could survive that high tension once, we can again. And here's another one for you. It's October 1950. America, South Korea, and the United Nations forces are along the Yalu River after successfully invading the North. General Douglas MacArthur is in charge of this campaign. Concepts like mutually assured destruction were not yet even thought of. Nuclear weapons were still viewed as a feasible solution to tricky battlefield situations. MacArthur thought he had a tricky enough situation. It was speculated that the Chinese would soon be involved in the war, crossing the border and pushing back the coalition per se to the 38th or worse. The bright idea of using tactical nukes was brought up by MacArthur. Quote, "The enemy's air would first have been taken out. I would have dropped between 30 and 50 tactical atomic bombs on his air bases and other depots strung across the neck of Manchuria from just across the Yalu at Atung on the neighbor of Hanshus." Those areas he mentioned are along the border of Korea with both China and the USSR. His goal was to, quote, "Our amphibious forces moved south to spread behind us. From the Sea of Japan to the Yellow Sea, a belt of radioactive cobalt," which would cause the area to remain radioactive for about 75 years. While the USSR was getting more involved over Korea is questionable, as communiques between Stalin and Mao have confirmed, the USSR was willing to get involved if China was invaded. It's unknown if MacArthur wanted to directly invade China, but bombing their border and asking for Taiwanese troops, it's probable that that was his end goal. If this was the case, and nuclear weapons were used on the border, more than probably Stalin would have used some as well. The Soviets had just tested their first atomic weapon a little over a year before, so retaliation wasn't that far-fetched. Eventually, MacArthur's pestering for permission to use nuclear weapons got him put on President Truman's shortlist. He was relieved from duty April 11, 1951. While I don't want to go over the whole Cuban Missile Crisis, as it is rehearsed so much, I do want to talk about a specific point in the crisis. The 27th of October, a day before the crisis was resolved, it almost came to a much more devastating end. The Americans were blockading the island and preventing Soviet ships and subs from gaining access. The subs were there as protection for both merchant and naval ships. They were armed with nuclear-tipped torpedoes. These were new weapons, and this deployment on 4 separate subs was the first to be equipped with them. While the Americans had found out about these torpedoes, they had questions. Who had the authority to use these weapons? Were they WMDs or tactical? And most importantly, would they use them? We can also look back and ask if these nuclear torpedoes increased the chance of nuclear war breaking out, and in my opinion, yes they did. When the subs were briefed on their mission, conventional and nuclear arms were to be at full combat readiness during their trip. The conventional weapons could be used at the order of the Admiral of the USSR's Navy, and the nuclear torpedoes only from explicit orders from the Defense Ministry. But one of the commanders of the subs, B-131, and his name is Nikolai Sirmakov, recalls the instructions to be more malleable. Quote, "The only person who talked to us about those weapons was Vice Admiral Roshanka. He said, 'Write down when you should use these, in 3 cases. First, if you get a hole under the water. A hole in your hole? This is the first case. Second, a hole above the water. If you have to come to the surface and they shoot at you, and you get a hole in your hull. And the third case, when Moscow orders you to use these weapons. These were our instructions, and then he added, I suggest to you, commanders, that you use the nuclear weapons first, and then you'll figure out what to do after that. And this sounds a lot more scary to me. This mission was very secret, and the subs had to stay underwater and move very slowly. This posed a problem as they were from the Soviet Northern Fleet and not equipped with tropical equipment. A quote from B-59's Assistant Commander Anatoly Andrei. For the first 4 days, they didn't even let us come up to the periscope depth. My head was bursting from the stuffy air. The regeneration of air works poorly. The carbon dioxide content is rising. Temperature in the sections is above 50. In the diesel, above 61 degrees. Already under political and military pressure, the subcrew was also incredibly uncomfortable, stuck in a metal tube underwater. When the sub launched, it was immediately found by the U.S. and its destination was assumed. As it approached the blockade, the U.S. ships dropped non-lethal depth charges in an attempt to make the sub surface. This only led the crew to believe that war had broken out. They were unable to communicate with Moscow due to the depth, so they did what they thought was right and flooded the torpedo tubes. 2 of the senior officers agreed that the launch of the torpedoes was necessary, but a unanimous decision by 3 officers was needed to fire the torpedoes, and 1 said no. Vasily Ekimopov convinced the other 2 officers that orders from Moscow should be received before launching nuclear weapons. The fate of the world once again was placed on the shoulders of 1 man. If it wasn't for his dissent, the torpedo would have detonated a global nuclear exchange and the destruction of humanity. Vasily passed away in 1998 and reached the rank of Vice Admiral. He was awarded the Future of Life Award, which his family received. His daughter, Ilana, said on receiving the award, quote, he always thought he did what he had to do and never considered his actions heroism. He acted like a man who knew what kind of disasters can come from radiation. He did his part for the future so that everyone can live on our planet. Unquote. And she's right. If it were up to me, everyone and their brother would go up and thank both Vasily Ankropov and Slatsov Petrov for their diligence in preserving human life. And that's just a few examples of how close we got to nuclear war. From the U.S. haphazardly dropping bombs all across the nation, and good old-fashioned Cold War paranoia over war games. I think the main takeaway here is how absolutely fragile fail-safes that we have in place really are. Sure, most of the bombs jettisoned by the U.S. didn't have a nuclear capsule in them, but some did, or at least the capsule was on board the flight. Not to mention, on 2 separate occasions, at least that we know of and that I described, the fate of the world was in the hands of 1 person. If it was the person sitting next to Stanislav or Vasily, the world could have been destroyed for all we know. When the Manhattan Project began, I doubt the scientists would have guessed that man could be so irresponsible with the weapons that could destroy his home. The doomsday clock now sits at an uncomfortable 2 minutes to midnight, a high that has not been seen since the height of the Cold War. Now more than ever do we need to remember the unsung heroes which put humanity over ideology. This is Nathan Coggeshall with Come Hell or Heavy Water. I'm going to dig out a bunker. I'll see y'all in the next one.